world's leading digital advertising visionaries. He was also Chief Product Officer at Simul Media and founder of artificial intelligence company for social media marketing and analysis named Solariat. Seeds is proud to announce the Director of Digital Platforms for GroupM, Jack Smith.
Thank you for having me. So I was asked to talk about trends toward 2020, and I picked 7. Even though I have 15 minutes, I'm going to try and get through all of them. But it's important to note that this is a progression. This just isn't something that will magically happen in 2020, but these are the things that we see across our clients, across the companies that we work with in fulfilling the desires and the goals of our clients that we see that shape the business. And it's important to talk a little bit about where we are today and kind of how we see, so the way in which we look at the market. We believe that media, data, and technology have merged. We used to talk about this as being in the future. Now we talk about it being in the past. So as a part of WPP Group, we work very closely with sister companies like Kantar and Wonderman, who have a tremendous amount of data because we can't really separate media and data and technology anymore. Technology changes really quickly, and consumer behavior changes more slowly. So sometimes it takes a long time for consumers to catch up. There are a few examples of exceptions to this, the iPhone being a good one, but generally it takes a long time for consumers to catch up, and the underlying effects are what are really important. So the gadget is not that important. In fact, they tend to be distractions in a lot of cases. We also believe in understanding the detail of how things work, and not just looking at things from a top-level view. We try and understand the mechanics of how things are connected together, the mechanics of how things work, because it tends to, we believe, inform a better view of the effects it will have on our own business and clients' business. And because of that, we look for things that affect society more generally, kind of beyond advertising and media specifically. And finally, we celebrate the joy of discovery because, like the folks in this room, we wouldn't be doing this if we weren't having fun doing it. The first thing I want to talk about is the rise of the interface. Now, this is something that's been going on actually for a long time, and we see companies. I see a lot of startups. I spend probably 20% of my time talking with startups, and everyone has a platform. But if you go back to the original platform, it was the General Motors A platform, which was introduced in 1936, and that picture is of the Oldsmobile Series F. And what makes this a platform is the fact that the very bottom, the chassis underneath the car, had a standard set of bolt patterns, and because that had that standard set of bolt patterns, you could put different bodies on the top. So you could put a Pontiac body on top, or you could put many different Pontiac bodies, in fact. You could put a Buick or a Chevrolet on top. As well, you could also swap out the engine, and that engine, again, as long as it conformed to that standard set of bolt patterns, a standard interface, you could create a new user experience out of this. Now later we saw products like the Gillette Mach 3, which is actually also a product platform. So this was common in manufacturing. This platform that GM used was actually in use for about 20 years, from a little over 20 years. The next wave, the innovation platform, was to externalize that, to allow other people to connect and other people to actually use the platform itself. And what Amazon did that was interesting for us, and particularly for technologists, is they respected this interface. So they said, if I have a well-defined interface, I can create components, and I can connect those components together. And if I want to take one out, if I want to have a different server, a different powered server, as long as I respect the interface, I can connect it to other parts of the system. And then they made that available for other people to use. But it required, for them to be able to do that, it required that interface was respected. Now, we all know about the interfaces between people. We won't talk about that among us adults, but they're increasingly important interfaces between people and technology and pieces of technology with other technologies, which bring about the rise of the Internet of Things. But the important thing is that interfaces are connections and translation points, right? So from one thing to another, You're connecting those things together, and in some cases you need to translate that. And interfaces also enable ecosystems. So we believe that the traditional tech stack is a dying thing, and it's being replaced with ecosystems. And the way we work with our clients and our partners, increasingly the technology that we make is part of that ecosystem. Next thing are the 3 C's, and I'll jump through this relatively quickly because I think it's going to be covered in a lot of sessions later. It's this virtuous triangle of computing, cloud, and connectivity, where each of these things together makes the other more powerful. So it enables the fact that you can have a smart watch. It makes the watch smart. You don't have to have all the processing power on the watch itself. You can connect it to the phone. That phone can connect to the cloud and store documents in the cloud. So you don't have to have a tremendous amount of storage on the phone itself or even on the watch. And the interface that you have with the watch, maybe speaking to that from a human to computer interface, makes it possible to actually connect yourself to the cloud via the watch and other devices. But when I talk about the Internet of Things and connecting things, I also have to talk about the insecurity of things, because I think there's a new frontier for hacking as we move toward 2020 and brands start bringing things online. We have to understand that connected things get hacked. And I think there are good kinds of hacks when consumers figure out a new way to use something that you've created and use it differently. But there are also bad kinds of hacks. So when you connect your house through a thermostat to the internet, it can be hacked. If you create a consumer product, as many of our brands do, with a connection point, then it's possible for that to be hacked. And I think one of the more exciting things, Plowman talked this morning about self-driving cars. If you're combating terrorism, you have to start thinking about hacking highways now. And within 5 to 10 years, your auto will be a target. Again, another topic I think will come up many times, and hopefully we'll talk about it in the discussion, is the inversion of scale. It used to be that as a media agency, we had a relatively low number of volumes of transactions at a relatively high price. And that's how we built our scale. So we represent at GroupM about 32% of all media spend globally. That changes when we have a low price transaction, or a small transaction, and those create a large volume. So we built a business called Zaxis to account for that, and that's one of the largest programmatic media business in the world. It also is interesting that the same applies to scaling audiences. So as media audiences fragment, the reassembly of those audiences mean that you have to scale the technology to be able to do that. You're instead of reaching a very large audience with a single television commercial, you're actually aggregating up many different audience members into one large-scale audience. And in most cases, you're measuring the effects and the differences of the media that you're showing them at the individual, anonymized individual level. With that scale comes an interesting kind of complexity. So about 10 years ago, I was working in this business. We had a search marketing client, and they sold musical instruments and musical instrument accessories. And they had about 75,000 individual products they were selling online. And they had about 3 search engines they were using, predominantly in the US, but in other markets as well. They had about 10 creative templates for each engine and product combination. They had approximately 4 keywords that they were using with each one. And if you multiply all of those out, it's extremely complex. So campaigns quickly in search reached a point where humans couldn't actually manage them. You couldn't actually use a human to manage every aspect of that campaign, and that's why we had search marketing tools, and now that's why we're seeing a lot of the programmatic tools being used now by many of the folks in the room. But there's a question that I always asked when I used to hire product managers. I would ask them a series of questions about scale and how do you understand the difference in complexity from sharpening 1 pencil to sharpening 10 pencils to sharpening 10 to the 100th pencils, because the way you solve that problem becomes different at every point, and you have to kind of anticipate the complexity And as it grows, how do you scale? And that's certainly a technological problem, but it's also a mindset change in the way that agencies and our clients are thinking about solving problems. Again, we're trying to sharpen many trillions of pencils, Google of pencils, I guess, here. Actually, it's interesting, the best answer I got from someone I asked this question to in an interview was, well, you're probably better off actually buying the pencils pre-sharpened rather than actually sharpening them yourself. Mobility isn't about the device. It's about behavior, and behavior changes as people become mobile. And Plowman talked about Sebastian Thrun, who used to run the self-driving car project at Google, and I had a conversation with him about actually driving the car, because this was kind of early days when they were testing it, and he had taken it on a ski trip, and I said, what did you do while you were behind the wheel? Because in California, you have to sit behind the wheel, and there's still a steering wheel there. We're not rid of steering wheels and controls yet, but he said, I read a book. Notice he didn't say he checked his email. He actually read a book. So that kind of mobility and the freeing up of time, it changes the way that we as agencies work with our brands to interact and have conversations with consumers. And it changed it very dramatically. If you go to Asia, for example, certain parts of, particularly in Northern Europe, you see pronounced differences. And those differences are amplified based on culture. The way that people interact outside of a digital environment has a lot to do with what happens when social media is introduced and how they interact on those social media platforms. So Facebook and Twitter haven't really homogenized that. There's still cultural differences that we need to understand, because we're working with clients on large scales across a number of different kinds of markets. I think the biggest change by far, and it has far-reaching effect, is the world we live in is now a world of research without questions, right? So when we used to do research, and I used to do radio research a long time ago, we used to ask people, we used to sample of people who listened to the radio station and weren't listeners what they thought, and we kind of projected that onto the rest of the market. We ask fewer questions now than we ever have, and we're relying on data and information to tell us, and through the power of observation, we try and derive some level of understanding from that. And that's a very, very different kind of thing. And it's really at the heart of the question is, what can we learn just by observing, right? What can we learn and what can we know? But just, I'm actually not going to talk about privacy here because I think it's going to come up later, but you do have to address the elephant in the room is that when we think about this area, it absolutely must be informed by consumer rights and consumer interests. That's privacy, respect, relevancy, et cetera, and that has to be a base level consideration. It's not enough just to be compliant with laws. It's actually, you have to go beyond that, and you have to have some respect for the consumer, because if the consumer rejects you, then you're out of business anyway, even if you're complying with laws. So what's actually most interesting to me about this as a technologist and someone who's been in the media business a while is how is this possible? So how do we get here? And then what kinds of things can the data say? Well, if you look at the tools that were developed, it used to be in the United States that the government funded innovation. That doesn't occur anymore. Now, venture capital funds a lot of innovation through investments in companies like Google and other startups. Many startups in this room have venture funding. But the tools that allow us to get here to this world of research without questions were developed to solve commercial problems. So the best example of that at scale, which definitely is going to be talked about a lot over the next 2 days, is Hadoop and MapReduce. So in 1994, Google Labs published a paper about MapReduce. And MapReduce, for those who don't know, is an algorithm. It's a way to process a large amount of data across clusters of computers and make it very efficient and very fast. So Doug Cutting, who was working at Yahoo at the time, saw this and said, well, we need an efficient way to actually have all these servers and manage and store this data, and he created Hadoop. That Hadoop project, which became open source, gave rise to a lot of what we're talking about in research without questions, and that's the fact that you do have the power of observation. You do have the ability to use data that we couldn't afford to process before. And again, satisfying all the societal and legal requirements, it's important to understand the effects of that go beyond media and marketing. And this is what's really, really key. So for our clients' businesses, we actually see this affecting product development. So using social media, anonymous social media posts to understand consumer reaction to features. It's a consumer electronics client who was doing this. They also, in fact, use it to determine which spokesperson they should be using for their products. It also affects quality control and how companies are doing support. And finally, there's a much greater far-reaching impact across society, and particularly in two areas, education and healthcare. Quick anecdote, I have 11 seconds before I get cut off, but there are two colleagues that I worked with who worked in advertising who took leaves of absence to work on sequencing DNA for cancer research. So the science that's coming across and the tools that were created to solve these commercial problems now allow us to attack problems that are well beyond our purview, which is relatively minor in the grand context of things. So thank you very much.